The scream echoed through the cold stone corridors of the Louvre Palace on a frigid January dawn in 1393. A sound that did not seem to emanate from a human throat, but from something deeper, more primitive, something that had shattered irreparably. Within the soul of a man who had once been called king, the guards hesitated before the locked door of the royal chambers, their faces pale in the flickering torchlight, knowing that on the other side lay no longer Charles VI of France, the beloved, but an unrecognizable creature, methodically, chewing pieces of his own flesh, his glassy eyes fixed on an invisible point in the infinite. Just 15 years earlier, in 1380, when Charles had ascended the throne at the age of 12, Paris had teemed with hope and ceremonial splendor. The young monarch possessed an almost angelic beauty that made the ladies of the court whisper prayers of gratitude and the nobles bow with genuine reverence. His golden hair fell in perfect waves over his shoulders, framing a face of delicate features that seemed sculpted by a divine artisan. His brilliant blue eyes shone with a precocious intelligence that promised an era of glory for France, still bleeding from the wounds of the 100 Years' War. His long, aristocratic hands held the royal scepter with a firmness that belied his youth, and when he spoke, his crystalline voice echoed through the palace halls with the natural authority of one born to rule. The French court of the 1380s was a universe of almost obscene luxury, where gold flowed like water and banquets lasted entire nights under the light of 1,000 beeswax candles. Charles moved through this world with the innate grace of a swan, his presence magnetizing every gaze. He wore velvet garments embroidered with silver threads, his soft leather boots barely touching the marble floors as he walked the royal apartments. The teenage king adored the arts, patronizing poets and musicians who composed ballads about his magnificence, and his personal library grew daily with illuminated manuscripts that cost fortunes. In the early years of his reign, Charles seemed the embodiment of the French monarchy at its zenith, young, beautiful, intelligent, and beloved by a people who saw him as a gift from the heavens. But there was something in Charles's eyes, even in those gilded days, that disturbed the most attentive observers. The royal physician, Master William Harsigny, a man with graying beard and trembling hands who had served 3 kings, recorded unsettling observations in his private journal about episodes of deep melancholy that afflicted the young monarch. His Majesty remains for hours staring into nothingness, he wrote in small, nervous script, as if contemplating horrors invisible to mortal eyes. At times, his hands tremble without apparent cause, and a cold sweat bathes his brow even. On mild days, these notes, discovered centuries later among dusty parchments, revealed the first signs of an illness that would slowly consume the king's mind like a flame devouring ancient parchment. The first great outbreak occurred in August 1392, during a military expedition against the Duke of Brittany. The day was oppressively hot, the air thick as molasses, when Charles, now 24, rode at the head of his army through the forest of Le Mans. The clang of armor and the neighing of horses created a martial symphony that echoed among the ancient trees. Suddenly, without warning, a page dropped a lance that clattered noisily against a rock. The metallic sound cut through the air like a blade, and something irreparably shattered in the king's mind. Charles drew his sword from its sheath with a wild movement, his blue eyes turning glassy and empty, as if a curtain had fallen over his soul. He began attacking his own men with bestial fury, screaming that they were traitors sent to assassinate him. His voice, once melodious, had transformed into a guttural snarl that did not sound human. The Duke of Burgundy, his uncle, had to order the soldiers to overpower and bind him like a wild animal. For 4 days, Charles remained in a state of feverish unconsciousness, his body twisting in violent spasms as he raved about invisible enemies and demons pursuing him. When he finally awoke, he remembered nothing. His eyes briefly regained their former lucidity, but something had been lost forever. An innocence, a connection with reality that would never be completely restored. The courtiers noticed a subtle change in his expression, as if he were constantly listening to voices no one else could hear. His hands developed an almost imperceptible tremor, and at times he would interrupt conversations to stare with disturbing intensity at some empty point in the air. From that moment on, the episodes of madness began to intensify with terrifying regularity. At first, they occurred only a few times a year, but gradually they became more frequent and devastating. During these crises, Charles did not recognize his own wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman of exuberant beauty and strong temperament who had married him out of genuine love. She came to dread the episodes with visceral terror, for during them the king called her a witch and a demon, accusing her of having poisoned his mind with malevolent potions. The court's physicians, scholarly men trained at Europe's finest universities, desperately tried to understand and cure the illness consuming their sovereign. They bled him with leeches until his skin turned pale as parchment, applied poultices of exotic herbs to his skull, made him ingest repugnant potions prepared with unicorn powder and virgin's tears. Nothing worked. The madness seemed to have roots too deep, feeding on some dark source that the knowledge of the time could not reach. During periods of lucidity, which grew increasingly rare and brief, Charles displayed an agonizing awareness of his condition. In a letter dictated to his private secretary in 1394, he wrote with touching eloquence, "I feel my reason slipping through my fingers like fine sand, and I can do nothing to stop it. Sometimes I wake not knowing who I am, where I am, or why. Everyone looks at me with terror in their eyes. Has God abandoned me, or have I abandoned him? I no longer know how to tell the difference." These words, preserved in the Vatican's secret archives, reveal the psychological torture the king endured in those moments when he still possessed enough clarity of mind to comprehend his deterioration. The French court, once a model of elegance and sophistication for all of Europe, gradually transformed into an atmosphere of suspense and horror. The nobles walked the corridors in silence, whispering among themselves about the latest episodes of the king. Festivities became rare and somber, interrupted whenever news of a new crisis arrived. Foreign ambassadors reported disturbing descriptions of Charles's mental state to their sovereigns, and France began to be seen by other kingdoms as a nation ruled by madness. The most disturbing reports concerned the king's behavior during the most severe outbreaks. According to witnesses, he would spend entire days talking to invisible people, gesturing violently and answering questions no one had asked. At times, he refused to eat any food, convinced that everything was poisoned, and starved himself dramatically until his bones became visible beneath taut skin. On other occasions, he devoured enormous amounts of food with his hands like a savage, licking the plates and snarling at anyone who tried to approach. But it was in 1395 that the incident occurred, which would be whispered in corridors for generations. During one of the most severe episodes of his illness, Charles was found in his private chambers in a scene that traumatized everyone present forever. He had torn pieces of skin from his own arms and legs with his fingernails, which had grown compulsively long like claws. The smell of coagulated blood filled the air, mingled with the acrid odor of sweat and urine. But the most horrific aspect was that he had put some of those pieces of flesh into his mouth, methodically chewing them while staring fixedly at a spot on the wall where, he shouted, there was a mirror showing his true demonic form. The royal physician who arrived first at the room vomited immediately upon seeing the scene. In his journal, he wrote with trembling hand, "I never imagined the human mind could break down so completely." His Majesty had not only injured his own body, but was consuming his flesh as if it were a feast. His eyes showed no recognition of pain or horror, only a dreadful hunger that seemed to come from some unfathomable abyss of his soul. This account, discovered only in the 19th century, became one of the most disturbing documents in medieval French history. After that incident, Charles was kept under constant watch, but the episodes of self-harm and anthropophagy continued sporadically. The guards reported that on certain new moon nights, they could hear him chewing something in his chambers, and by morning, they would find small open wounds on his arms and legs, some clearly made by human teeth. The king seemed to have developed a morbid obsession with his own body, constantly examining his skin and whispering that it did not truly belong. To him, that it had been sewn onto his real form by demons while he slept. Queen Isabeau, initially devoted to her husband, began to live in a state of constant terror. She confided to her confessor, Father Anthony of Rieux, that Charles frequently woke her in the middle of the night, whispering that he could taste his own soul in his mouth and needed to spit out pieces of himself to avoid being completely contaminated. "He looks at me as if I am responsible for his curse," she wrote in a letter to her sister in Bavaria, "and sometimes I think perhaps I am. Perhaps my love for him has somehow drawn this divine misfortune upon our heads." The following years saw an accelerated deterioration not only of Charles's mind, but also of his body. The constant self-inflicted wounds had left his skin covered with scars and lesions that never fully healed. His weight plummeted, transforming him into a skeletal figure that barely resembled the majestic young king of old. His hair, once golden and silky, became dull and brittle, falling in clumps that he compulsively tore out during the most acute episodes. His fingernails, when not forcibly trimmed by the servants, grew in grotesque spirals that he used to gouge new wounds in his skin. The most disturbing change was in his voice. In the rare moments of lucidity, it sounded weak and hoarse, as if he had screamed for days. But during the attacks, it became something inhuman, sometimes a hissing whisper that froze the blood of listeners, other times a bestial roar that echoed through the palace corridors like the sound of a wounded beast. The servants reported that on certain nights they could hear him speaking in languages no one recognized, as if negotiating with entities from other worlds. France, in the meantime, plunged into chaos. With the king incapacitated, the most powerful nobles waged violent disputes for control of the realm. The Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans engaged in an undeclared civil war, each claiming to act in the name of the deranged monarch. Military campaigns against England were abandoned, taxes ceased to be collected efficiently, and peasant revolts erupted throughout the land. It was as though Charles's madness had spread like a plague, infecting the entire political body of the nation. In 1404, during one of the longest episodes of his illness, which lasted nearly 6 months, Charles developed a new, terrifying obsession. He came to believe he was made of glass and that any sudden movement would shatter him into 1,000 fragments. He remained motionless for hours, barely breathing, his eyes wide with terror. When the servants tried to feed him or clean his wounds, he screamed that they were cracking his glass surface, that he could hear the sound of his own fragility crumbling. During this period, he refused to eat anything, convinced that food would collide with his internal glass walls and kill him. It was at this time that the final, most horrifying incident occurred. On a winter dawn in 1405, the guards heard a sound they would never forget. Not exactly a scream, but something between a moan of agony and a roar of ecstasy. When they finally broke down the door to the royal chambers, they found Charles seated in the middle of the room, surrounded by small pools of blood. He had, with manic patience, completely gnawed the flesh off 2 fingers of his left hand, leaving only the exposed, gleaming bones. His mouth was stained with blood, and he slowly chewed the last pieces of flesh, his eyes fixed in terrible rapture. "I can feel myself on the inside," he murmured repeatedly. "I can finally feel myself on the inside." His voice was barely audible but carried a disturbing satisfaction that made several guards vomit on the spot. The royal physician, already a man broken by decades of horror he had witnessed, simply knelt and wept, unable to process the magnitude of human devastation before his eyes. That was the last great documented episode of self-mutilation and cannibalism by Charles. In the following years, he entered a kind of permanent stupor, rarely showing any awareness of the world around him. His mind, it seemed, had withdrawn entirely from reality, leaving only a fragile, damaged body that continued to breathe more from habit than from any will to live. The violent episodes ceased, but were replaced by an even more disturbing stillness. He would remain seated for days on end, staring at some distant point, occasionally moving his lips as if reciting silent prayers. The court gradually adapted to governing around the ghost of its king. Charles remained officially on the throne until his death in 1422, but his presence was merely symbolic, a constant reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the arbitrary nature of divine power. The nobles, who managed to secure audiences with him, reported that it was like talking to a wax statue that breathed and occasionally blinked, but showed no understanding of the words addressed to him. In the final years of his life, Charles became an almost mythical figure of horror and pity. Stories of his cannibalism spread throughout Europe, each more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed he had devoured parts of his own tongue, others that he had bitten his lips until only bone was left. Visiting ambassadors specifically requested not to be taken to the royal chambers, fearing that the sight of the mad king would give them permanent nightmares. Queen Isabeau, who had stood by her husband through nearly 2 decades of horror, finally succumbed to psychological pressure. In her later years, she herself exhibited signs of mental instability, talking to herself and showing episodes of acute paranoia. Some historians suggest that prolonged exposure to Charles's madness had somehow infected her own psyche, as if dementia were contagious through emotional proximity. When Charles VI finally died in October 1422, at the age of 53, his body was unrecognizable, ravaged by decades of self-inflicted wounds. His hands, in particular, were a mass of scars and deformities, where fingers had been partially devoured and then poorly healed. His face, once angelic, was hollowed and prematurely aged, with deep wrinkles as if carved by constant pain. His eyes, when they closed for the last time, still held an expression of terror that made the embalmers bless themselves repeatedly. Charles's funeral was a strange and unsettling ceremony. Though all the royal pomp was observed, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of barely concealed relief among those present. France had finally rid itself of its deranged king, but the collective trauma of nearly 3 decades of royal madness had left deep scars on the national psyche. For generations, the name of Charles VI would be whispered as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fundamental vulnerability of human sanity. The medical documents on Charles's case, preserved in the Vatican archives and various European universities, continue to fascinate modern psychiatrists. Their detailed descriptions of episodes of self-cannibalism, body dysmorphia, and persistent psychosis offer a rare glimpse into mental illness in its most extreme and destructive form. Some contemporary experts suggest that Charles may have suffered from a combination of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and Cotard's syndrome, a rare condition in which the patient believes they are dead or that parts of their body do not exist. But beyond clinical explanations, the story of Charles VI's remains one of the most disturbing case studies of the absolute isolation of madness. In a world without modern psychiatric understanding, without effective medications or appropriate therapies, he was abandoned to navigate alone the darkest territories of the human mind. His self-mutilation and cannibalism can be seen not only as symptoms of mental illness, but as desperate attempts to exert some control over a body and a reality that had become utterly alien to him. The tragedy of Charles VI transcends his individuality to become a universal symbol of the limits of human understanding and the fundamental vulnerability of our sanity. He was a man who literally consumed himself, devouring not only his own flesh, but his identity, his humanity, and his connection with the living world. His story serves as a grim reminder that behind the facade of civilization and power, we all carry within us the capacity for absolute horror, not only against others, but against ourselves. In his destroyed brain cells, Charles had found a particular hell where he was simultaneously torturer and victim, predator and prey. In that inner universe of pain and confusion, consuming his own flesh perhaps represented the only form of genuine connection he could still establish. A terrible communion with himself that transcended the barriers imposed by his mental illness. It was, in his distorted logic, an act of self-love taken to its most grotesque extreme.